A quick word before we get into this week's episode.
I was talking to a head of school recently who said, Peter, we've got a strong strategic plan, but every time we try to act on it, things stall. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. Big goals are easy to write down, but they often get bogged down in the daily, making it hard to stay strategic. That's why I built the school operating system. It's a framework that helps you align your team and focus your priorities so you can actually execute the plan. We work alongside you to extrapolate a one-year plan from your existing strategic plan, break it into 90-day sprints, and design a much more effective meeting rhythm that moves your team closer to your strategic vision every single day. And that's just the start. We support much more to help you build the operational infrastructure your plan needs to succeed. If you're serious about making traction this year, let's talk. Visit moonshotos.com/SOS. That's MOONSHOTOS.com/SOS to learn more and set up a time to chat about the school operating system. Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. Arty Smith, who's a faculty member at Kent Denver School and the founder of the Gambling Awareness Initiative, is here today. This is going to be a little bit of a different pod, not necessarily like business model related, but I think it's such an interesting topic and one that is important to me as a parent. I'm sure important to many of the people who are listening. And that's the question of gambling and how do we bring more awareness to our students. And Arty started this nonprofit gambling awareness initiative, and we're going to dig into it, kind of understand the origin story, and then kind of go from there. But before we do all that, Arty Smith, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Peter. It's very happy to be here today. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Hey, before we get going, can you introduce yourself? What your work at Kent Denver, and of course, Gambling Awareness Initiative.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, so I've been teaching my whole life. When I was 22 years old, I started teaching in independent schools, bounced around a little bit, but I've found a home here at Kent Denver, and next year will be my 25th year here at Kent. Like many independent school teachers, I've worn a lot of hats in my career, teacher, coach, advisor, you name it, I've done it. I've been a math teacher my whole career. I kind of came to specialize in statistics, and I've taught AP Stat for about 25 years. And about 10 years ago, I recognized that fundamentally the world was kind of changing. It's now a data-driven world. To me, it seemed obvious that we needed to start teaching more data science in high school curricula. So I kind of took it upon myself to learn that. And 7 years ago, I started teaching an elective in data science for seniors. And that first elective focused on the sports business. If you've ever seen the movie Moneyball, that's kind of where we start. And now I teach a second elective in data science as well. And that second one teaches data science by illuminating issues of social justice in our world. Both electives have become very popular. I think they're great ways to learn data science. And I think the beauty of it is that those techniques that we learn by looking at sports or social justice, they can be used in any area of the world, business or anything else. And then fairly recently, this winter, in fact, a friend reached out to me, and he had a argument with his son the night before. His son wanted to start gambling on sports, and they'd been back and forth on it. My friend felt like the conversation hadn't gone very well. Indeed, he feared that his son now wanted to gamble even more, that knowing that his father was against it. And my friend reached out asking for advice. And it kind of occurred to me that we as a society are really not prepared for what we're going to say to our children about this new vice. And it got me thinking. And really what's motivated me over the last couple months is one simple question. If I could get a room full of teenagers together for 30 minutes, what would I want to tell them about sports gambling? And that's kind of where the Gambling Awareness Initiative began. And that's what I've been working on.
So you're actually going into schools and working with students and just laying out the pitfalls of gambling. Like, how do you approach it?
Yeah, it's a great question. My approach, I think, is fairly unique. The first thing I do is try to just make people aware of the depth and the breadth of the problem. In 2018, the Supreme Court left it up to each state as to whether they want to legalize sports gambling. And pretty quickly, it's spread across the country. There's now 39 states that have legalized sports gambling in some form. And the first thing I want to do is just make people aware of exactly where we stand in this. How many Americans are gambling? Who's it affecting the most? What are the consequences? I spend about 15 minutes doing that in my presentation. And after that, I kind of pivot. And the second question, kind of the harder question, if I'm honest with you, is what can I say that would have a protective effect on our children, right? What could I, give them in 15 minutes that might really protect them in the future? And kind of what I've come up with is attacking the cognitive bias that we often see in gamblers, especially in young men. That is, for example, a recent study asked 2,000 gamblers, why do you do it? Why do you gamble? And the number one response, it was given by 65% of the respondents, was that they gamble to make money. And that is overconfidence. And we see that especially in young men. And there's this illusion of control with gambling, right? We think that we, are better at this, that we have more control over outcomes than we actually do. And what I do in my presentation is try to refute that. And I use math. I use a lot of data. Indeed, I take data on every NFL game that's been played since 1966. And we look at over-under betting, which I think is the simplest bet to explain to people. And in essence, what I can show is that market is incredibly efficient. Indeed, since 2018, since we legalized sports gambling, in the NFL, the over has hit 50.0000% of the time, and the under is 50.000% of the time. That is how accurate these sports books are at setting the lines. And kind of what I go on to show is that, in essence, there is no difference between my ability or your ability or Peyton Manning's ability, for that matter, to pick over-unders as there is for us to pick heads or tails on a coin flip, right? It's truly a random event. You can't be good at this. You can be lucky or unlucky, all right? But in the long run, with the odds stacked against you the way that they are, it is inevitable that you are going to lose money. It's not a question of if you're going to lose or when you're going to lose. It's just a matter of how fast you're going to lose it. And I finish by kind of illuminating what are the worst bets in a casino. Turns out that the bets that the sports books are pushing our kids into, their parlays, their live betting, okay? And I demonstrate just how bad those bets are. And my hope is that kids who will see this are going to be less prone to gambling. And if they do gamble, hopefully they're going to do it in a more controlled fashion, knowing that they're not going to profit from this, and approaching it with kind of a more sane mindset, if you will.
When we spoke, so we did a pre-call and we're chatting about this topic, and you had said that just so many senior boys that of are gambling on sports, and it just seems like it's a thing. I know my daughter has mentioned it to me before, and even my younger one said, "Hey, Dad, like, can I bet?" And I was like, "I don't think so, buddy." So it's a problem, obviously, and it's becoming more pervasive. But for you, like, what are the warning signs, and how should independent schools be? Again, to think about, well, how do I identify these kids? What kind of behavior should I be looking for on campus?
That's a great question. It's a hard thing because, unlike other vices, sports gambling is a really easy one to hide, right? If a kid's been drinking, you can see it. If they've been smoking, you can smell it. But sports gambling, it's just a kid on their phone, and we see that all the time, right? So it's really easy to overlook it. I think the warning signs first really manifest in informal situations. That's when I first noticed it with kids, right? So between classes, right? Kids, the old class is filtering out, the new class is filtering in. There's 10 minutes there where it's pretty informal. Kids are talking about, all the things that kids talk about. And what I first noticed a couple of years ago was kids starting to use the language of sports gambling. I started to hear kids use the word parlay, which they never used to. I used to hear kids, talking about the over-under, not even necessarily about sports, but what's the over-under on my quiz on this test score, or test grade.
It's become part of our common vocab. Yeah,
exactly. Right. Yeah. So once you start hearing kids talk about those things, it's a pretty good indicator that they are gambling. And then, I often talk to coaches, and coaches are around kids in a lot of informal settings, right? You're driving the team bus. you've got a dozen basketball players in the back and they forget that you're there, right? They're talking about everything. And, I was talking to a basketball coach this weekend and he told me he thought every boy on his basketball team was gambling. So we're starting to hear it in those informal settings. And I think, Peter, especially as men often relate, right? If I'm meet somebody new and we're making small talk, one of the things that often comes up when men are talking is sports. Well, now I think it's sports gambling, which is popping up all the time. And I started to notice a change in those conversations here on campus from, hey, Mr. Smith, who do you think is going to win the Super Bowl this year? I've been having that conversation with kids for a long, long time. But now, all of a sudden you've got kids who are, asking about odds and probabilities, and they're looking at this from a very different perspective. And I've been teaching for a long time. It transitioned from first, I think we were just sports fans, and then fantasy sports. Fantasy football became so huge for so long. And that was kind of gambling light, I guess, if you will. And now in the last couple of years, it's straight up sports gambling when they're talking about betting parlays and over-unders and all these different things.
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere.
ESPN has its own sports book. It's just like, it's almost impossible to avoid it.
Yeah, it is. And, one of the things that's so scary is that there's virtually no regulations on advertising and how these sports books can target our kids. Once they get a gambling app on their phone, there's no, recurring age verification. Once it's on your phone, it's on there and you just got to log on and you can start to bet.
All right. I'm totally naive, but how are kids funding this?
That's a good question. And I think it depends, right? Here in the independent schools, typically we've got a more wealthy clientele. Kids are taking money that they're given for Christmas or their birthdays and they're putting it into sports books or maybe money from summer jobs, things like that. When I talk to less advantaged kids, it's whatever they can find. They're putting some of their allowance in there. They're putting, if they're working part-time jobs, some of that money is going into these sports books. And the scary thing, Peter, is that these kids see this sports gambling as a way to make more money, and not as a way to lose these hard-earned dollars.
And now a word from our sponsor. Leading a school today can mean juggling a dozen different systems across offices, finance, fundraising, marketing, enrollment, and academics, all pulling your attention in different directions. At Blackbaud, we believe it shouldn't be that way. That's why we built Blackbaud's Total School Solution. It's a fully connected solution designed for private and independent school leaders who want a clear view of their entire operation. From tuition to transcript to donation, you get one ecosystem, one login, and one source of truth. This isn't about more software. It's about smarter strategy. When your systems work together, you spend less time chasing down data and more time leading. Want to see what Blackbaud's Total School Solution could do for your school? Visit blackbaud.com. That's BLACKBAUD.com to learn more. So where do independent schools come into this equation? What kind of responsibility do you think they have, and how might they approach this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that this is something that we need to start addressing, right? Independent schools are so good at preparing our kids for the dangers of drugs and alcohol, unsafe sex. There's a new one, right? And it's sports gambling. I think we're going to need to address this. And the beautiful thing about independent schools is that we will all find our own approach to this. And I really am curious to see how that pans out. My belief is that, an academic approach to this is maybe the strongest. Okay. And like I was describing earlier, a kind of a mathematical and data-driven approach, I think can really tap into teenagers' natural skepticism of being taken advantage of by big corporations. And really fundamentally, that is what is happening here, right? This is not fair competition. These sports books have all the information. They're using AI to place, to price these bets. And there's no way that a 16-year-old kid or a 54-year-old man, for that matter, can compete with AI and all the data that they have. It's rigged against us. So I think what independent schools need to do is start addressing this, right? And education is the way to go. My belief is that getting a speaker in, an expert to come and talk to the kids, make them aware of this problem. And not only the kids, but also the adults in the community, right? I think a lot of schools that I'm talking to are unaware that they have a problem. So making the faculty, the administration aware of the problem. And then I think the third leg to this is the parents. I think that especially the parents of teenage boys are increasingly aware that there is a problem, but we're not sure how to address it. What those conversations should look like, and how we can convince kids to be smart about this and not to be taken advantage of. So my model is to go in, speak to the kids during the day, speak to the parents at night, and then leave some follow-up lessons that schools can address in the coming days or weeks. For example, I think one of the questions that I always recommend that could be addressed in advisory or class meetings, those types of things, is, as a society, what obligation do we have to the most vulnerable amongst us, right? The bottom 5% of gamblers, those who become addicted, who are prone to potentially lose everything, right? To go bankrupt, to homelessness, right? The bottom it's bottomless, right? You can lose everything that you've got here. But as a society, what obligation do we have to protect these people? And should it come from government? Should it come from the sports books? I think it's a really interesting question. And it, kind of ties into other questions about how we as a society treat, the poorest amongst us, and what our social safety net should look like. And I think that there's a legitimate room for debate there. And one of the nice things about it is that kids don't necessarily know what the Republican response to this and what the Democratic response to this is. So you can get some good conversations here. They're not already pigeonholed into one or the other. Another, I think, follow-up that I offer here is I offer access to some data visualizations that I've created. Like I said, I took data from every NFL game going back to 1966. And I've created these interactive data visualizations that kids can explore. This would be a little bit more mathematical in nature. They might want to have their AP stat teacher there, or any math teacher, I guess, for that matter, but to try to look for inefficiencies in these betting markets. And they're not going to find any, right? For example, one of the hypotheses that I would encourage them to investigate is when the weather's really cold in an NFL game, say below 32 degrees, it can be hard to play. Does that mean there's going to be less scoring in the game? Does the under hit more often? And using these interactive data visualizations, the kids can filter it down, just look at the games when it's a temperature less than 32 degrees. And lo and behold, what they're going to find is that those games are priced correctly. There's no inefficiencies in this market. You're not going to outsmart these sports books.
Instinct isn't going to beat the data.
No, it's not.
Yeah. I go back to where you started, like how this whole thing came about when your friend called you, had a difficult conversation with his son, not sure it went particularly well, concerned about, it maybe just, pouring gas on the fire, right? All those things. So it really strikes me that the parent, like if this is a multi-part equation, like that component that is the parent is so important.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. It's interesting as I've started to market this, and I've been teaching my whole life. I've never had to market and do those things before, network. It's been very interesting and eye-opening. But I get very different responses, right, from different clienteles, and some schools, like I said, they don't think that they have a problem. But inevitably, the strongest responses that I'm getting are from the teenagers themselves, right? The seniors, the juniors in high school. Oh my God, Mr. Smith, you're the perfect guy to do this. My friends need to hear this. They need to hear this tonight. There's such a problem. And then also the parents who are just so thankful that they now have, kind of a common language that they can talk to their kids about this and discuss this in a really meaningful and intelligent way. And not to say, don't do with it, this is stupid, but I don't think you want to do this. Here's why, here's what can come of this. And if you are going to do it, this is really how you need to think about it. And it's, like with drugs, like with alcohol, I think that we want ideally abstinence, right, from our kids. But inevitably, as they become adults, our kids are probably going to have a drink in their lives. A lot of them are going to gamble on sports, and we just want them to do that in a responsible fashion, knowing the pitfalls, knowing how dangerous it can be, and knowing how it can hurt not only yourself, but those around you. What are the consequences of this? Um, so the responses from all these different constituencies have been fascinating for sure.
So, when we spoke earlier, you had mentioned that other countries are maybe a little more advanced in their thinking when it comes to, how to treat this and how to provide support. I think you talked about Australia and UK in particular, and that they're actually treating it as a public health issue.
Yeah.
So, what can our schools learn from that?
Yeah, it was a great question. And, in the UK, for example, it's now federal law. Every high school needs to provide gambling education, right? It's no different than sex ed or drugs and alcohol. I think inevitably our society needs to move in that direction. Um, I think that as a society, there are some other steps that we could take that we've seen both Great Britain and Australia take in terms of restricting some of the advertisements and also some of the introductory promo offers. It's amazing right now on any one of these sports books. Peter, you could sign up tonight and they'd give you $200 in free bets to sign up. Right? $200. And who doesn't want that? Well, of course, they know they give that to you today, they're going to get that money back and probably a tenfold profit on top of it. And it's kind of insane that they're doing this. They're literally dangling this incentive in front of kids who are vulnerable to addiction. So I think as a society, there's some common sense things that we can do here. Another one would be not allowing people to gamble on credit. It seems crazy to me that you can make a deposit from your credit card into your sports gambling account. All of a sudden now it's much easier to go in debt, right? And I hope we will take some of these common sense measures. But in the meantime, I really think that one of the few guardrails that are in place is just strong communities. And that's what independent schools are so famous for, right? We've got these great communities that are protective in nature. And my hope is that schools that address this head on are going to have a protective effect on one another. Certainly at every one of our schools, there are kids right now who need help with their gambling. And hopefully if they see a presentation on this, their friends are going to step in. Maybe the adults will step in if they're aware of the problem. And then in the future, certainly a lot more of us are going to need help. Kind of a scary statistic, as bad as things are right now. Goldman Sachs estimates that the revenue in this market will quadruple before we hit an equilibrium. It's just going to get worse before it gets better.
So, I'm thinking about like coaches at schools, teachers, maybe they don't have access to the work that you're doing. They're just thinking about, okay, well, what can I do? What are some simple things that they can do to prevent these kind of behaviors?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think first and foremost is we need to, kind of address it when we hear these kids talking about it. Right? We can't just turn a blind eye when we hear a whole basketball team talking about gambling. We need to step in and say something there. And coaches have a lot on their plates. I know, I've been there, and they're not necessarily trained on this. My hope is that as the adults in the communities are trained on this, that they will then have a thoughtful response. Guys, this is inappropriate, and here's why you shouldn't be gambling. Here are the pitfalls, and I think that is really kind of the most important and powerful thing that independent schools have to offer these constituencies. It's just that protective effect that collectively we can muster.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, so as we begin to wrap up, I'm curious. You said that this is a relatively new initiative for you, so congrats on that. That's really exciting. So what's next? What do you see for the future? How can you make a bigger impact, in our communities?
Yeah. So I've been starting, and I, just got started this winter. So this is all very new to me. But I've been starting by reaching out to, kind of big organizations, right? To try to get in front of head of the upper school, the dean of wellness, those types of people. So I've spoken at ISAS, I've spoken in ICASIA, and that's been very helpful to try to get this message out there. And I'm hoping to start speaking to more and more schools as this goes on. And then the other kind of avenue that I'm looking at here, at first I was just looking at independent schools. I've got a friend on the Denver school board, and we had coffee recently, and he kind of got the ball rolling a little bit for local public schools here, which is a different ball of wax to be sure, but it's been very, very interesting. And I found that the public schools are really interested in this, and they know that there's a problem, and they're eager to deal with it. But of course, funding is a big issue, especially now. A lot of public schools are facing budget cuts. So what I'm investigating right now, and I've got a lot of work ahead of me this summer, is some grant writing that might kind of make it so that I could get into some of the public schools, starting here in Colorado, but potentially in other states as well. And some of those are through the state government. Others are through private organizations. But I'm hopeful that will get the ball rolling in the public school space as well. But my hope is that independent schools will be the leader on this, as they often are. Whenever there's curriculum change that needs to happen, it's typically independent schools who are quickest to pivot and recognize a problem and address it and figure out the best ways to address it. So I'm kind of counting on independent schools to be the leaders that they have been for so long here, and to show the rest of the country this is maybe the best way to address this problem.
Arty Smith, faculty member, Kent Denver School, and founder of the Gambling Awareness Initiative. If somebody wants to reach out, how can they do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. You can always email me, asmith@kentdenver.org, or my website for the Gambling Awareness Initiative is abettorlife.com. The spelling on that is a little tricky, BETTOR, abettorlife.com. There's a lot of information on there, lots of articles, news stories, and also information about my speeches in particular.
Well, I'll certainly include that in the show notes so people have easy access.
Awesome.
Arty, thanks again. I do appreciate it.
Peter, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.